In 2019, the US government wanted to stop a European company from doing business with Iran. Here's the strange part, that company wasn't American. It had no offices in the US. It wasn't breaking any European law. It complied anyway. Not out of fear of American troops or American courts. Out of fear of being cut off from the US dollar. That's the moment worth sitting with. A country was able to control the business decisions of a company on the other side of the world, without a single soldier, a single warship, or a single direct order, just by controlling access to one currency. Nobody voted for this. No treaty explicitly granted this power. It happened quietly, over decades, through the plumbing of the global financial system. And most people using dollars every single day have no idea how much invisible power sits inside that piece of paper, or that string of digits in their bank app. Why this matters right now. Today, roughly 88% of all global currency trades involve the US dollar on at least one side of the transaction. Nearly half of all global trade invoices are priced in dollars, even trade between the countries that aren't the US at all. Central banks around the world hold the majority of their foreign currency reserves in dollars. This isn't a historical footnote. It's actively shaping global politics right now. Through sanctions on Russia after 2022, tension with China over trade and currency policy, and a growing movement of countries actively trying to reduce their dependence on the dollar altogether. Understanding how this power actually works is understanding one of the most important, least explained forces in the modern world. How the dollar actually gained this power. Let's trace the real mechanism, because this power wasn't automatic. It was built, deliberately, in stages. Stage 1, Bretton Woods, 1944. After World War II, representatives from 44 countries met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design the post-war global monetary system. They agreed to peg their currencies to the US dollar, which itself was pegged to gold. This made the dollar the anchor of the entire global financial system, essentially by design, at a moment when the US held the majority of the world's gold reserves and was the dominant economic power left standing after the war. Stage 2, the gold standard ends, but the dollar's role doesn't. In 1971, President Nixon ended the dollar's direct convertibility to gold, effectively ending the Bretton Woods system. Many expected the dollar's central role to fade without gold backing it. Instead, something else locked its dominance in even further. Stage 3, the Petrodollar system. In 1974, the US struck a deal with Saudi Arabia in exchange for military protection and support. Saudi Arabia agreed to price its oil exports exclusively in US dollars and to invest its oil revenue back into US assets. Other major oil-producing nations followed a similar pattern. Because virtually every country on Earth needs oil, and oil was priced almost exclusively in dollars, this created permanent, structural global demand for dollars that had nothing to do with gold at all. Stage 4, the dollar becomes the default infrastructure. Over decades, this demand compounded. Global banks built their systems around dollar transactions. International trade increasingly settled in dollars, purely because it was the most liquid, most trusted, most widely accepted option. This is what economists mean by network effects. The dollar became dominant partly because it was already dominant, and switching away became increasingly costly for everyone involved. The hidden math, how this becomes actual power. Here's where dollar dominance turns into direct geopolitical leverage. Most major international transactions, even ones with no direct US involvement, get processed through the SWIFT messaging system and ultimately clear through US dollar correspondent banks based in the United States, or through banks required to comply with US regulations to maintain their own access to dollars. This means the US Treasury can add a company, a bank, or an entire country to a sanctions list and effectively cut them off from the global financial system without needing cooperation from any other government. Iran, North Korea, and large parts of the Russian banking system have all experienced this directly. Here's the number that reveals the scale of this leverage. Studies on U.S. financial sanctions have shown that even foreign banks with no U.S. operations at all frequently comply with U.S. sanctions, purely to protect their own ability to conduct dollar-denominated business, a phenomenon researchers call the long arm of U.S. financial power, extending far beyond actual U.S. legal jurisdiction. This is the uncomfortable core of it. Dollar dominance doesn't just give America economic advantages. Like cheaper borrowing costs, privilege economists call exorbitant privilege, it gives the U.S. a functional veto over a huge share of global economic activity, enforced not through direct control, but through nearly everyone's structural dependence on dollar access. Hype versus reality. The dollar will collapse illusion. Every few years, headlines predict the dollar's imminent collapse, usually tied to rising U.S. debt. A new gold-backed currency proposal, or growing BRICS cooperation between Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. The reality is more complicated. Reducing dollar dependence, called de-dollarization, has been actively pursued for years. China and Russia now settle a meaningful share of their bilateral trade in their own currencies. And BRICS nations have discussed alternative payment systems and even a potential shared currency. But here's the irony worth sitting with. Building an alternative requires the exact same network effects, trust, and deep, liquid markets that took the dollar nearly 80 years to build. And no single alternative currency currently offers the combination of stability, liquidity, and near universal acceptance the dollar provides. China's Yuan, despite years of promotion, still accounts for a small single-digit percentage of global reserves, partly because China maintains strict capital controls that make the yuan far less flexible to hold and trade freely compared to the dollar. De-dollarization is a real, active trend, a dollar collapse, in the dramatic sense often predicted in headlines, remains a very different and far less immediately likely scenario. The closing thought, so the next time you hold a dollar, or watch a headline about sanctions cutting off some distant country from the global economy, remember what's actually happening underneath the surface. This isn't a currency that simply happens to be popular. It's the backbone of a system that gives one country an extraordinary amount of quiet leverage over the economic choices of nearly every other country on Earth, a form of power most people spend their entire lives depending on, without ever fully realizing it exists, which leaves behind the question worth sitting with: if a single country's currency can quietly determine which nations get to fully participate in the global economy, is that really just economics anymore? Or is it something closer to power dressed up as money?